How do people live without Christmas? I'll tell you, because I stole it. And I won. I stood at the edge of Mount Crumpet, watching the shadow of night cling to Whoville. The sun hadn't yet crept over the horizon, but I didn't need daylight to see what I'd done. The town was quiet, too quiet. No laughter. No songs. Just the hollow stillness that wrapped around me like the frost biting at my fur. Behind me, the sack loomed like a monument to my triumph. It sagged and bulged with everything they'd held dear. Glittering ornaments, delicately wrapped presents, candy canes, even their stockings. Every scrap of Christmas was mine. I'd pulled it off without a hitch. Their chimneys were no match for my cunning. Their holiday cheer, no match for my malice. Max whined from the cave, but I ignored him. Let him sulk. He didn't understand what I'd accomplished. I thought back to the night before. Slithering through their little houses, snatching everything in sight. Their roast beasts, their pudding, their silly little lights. I even stole the crumbs off their tables. It wasn't enough to ruin Christmas. I had to erase it. And I did. Even when Cindy Lou Who caught me in the act, it didn't matter. The girl had wandered out of bed, rubbing her eyes, catching me mid-lie. But one flimsy excuse about fixing her tree, and she scampered back to her room, leaving me to finish the job. I could still see her face, wide-eyed, innocent, like she thought I wasn't the monster they whispered about. Like she thought I could be something else. I shook off the thought. It didn't matter. Cindy Lou Who wouldn't be smiling when she woke up to nothing. None of them would. I waited on that peak for the sun to rise, expecting chaos. I wanted to hear their screams of outrage, their sobs of despair. I wanted to see them unravel without their precious Christmas. But when the light finally broke over Whoville, the silence was deafening. No wailing. No shouting. Just nothing. I squinted down at the town, expecting to see them gathered in the square, their faces twisted in misery. But the Whos didn't gather. They didn't move. They just stood there, staring at their empty houses, their barren streets. It wasn't the reaction I'd imagined. No fury. No tears. Just this stillness that made my skin crawl. At first, I told myself it was shock. They'd break soon enough. Give it a day, maybe two, and they'd turn on each other. They'd lash out, tear each other apart. And I'd be here, watching, savoring every second. But as the hours stretched into days, the silence didn't break. Whoville didn't erupt into chaos. It didn't erupt at all. They just stopped. The shops stayed closed. The streets stayed empty. Even the snow seemed to fall quieter. And I felt it. That creeping, gnawing weight settling over me. It started as a whisper, a faint unease I could brush off. But it grew louder with each passing day, until it was a roar in my head, impossible to ignore. How do people live without Christmas? I told myself I'd done what needed to be done. I told myself I'd won. But the question lingered, heavy and sharp. I'd stolen their lights, their gifts, their cheer. But maybe I'd taken something else. Something I didn't understand. And as I stood there, looking down at the quiet, empty town, I started to wonder, had I stolen from them? Or had I stolen from myself? The days stretched on, and the silence swallowed everything. From my perch on Mount Crumpet, I could see it all. Whoville didn't just stop celebrating Christmas, they stopped everything. The streets, once bustling with those obnoxious Whos, were empty. Shops stayed shuttered. Doors remained closed. Even the snow fell differently. It used to catch the light of their stupid decorations, sparkling in every color. Now it landed dull, gray, like it knew something was missing. At first, I thought I could enjoy it. The quiet, the stillness. No jingling bells, no cheerful voices, no noise. It was what I wanted, wasn't it? But the quiet wasn't what I thought it would be. It wasn't peaceful. It wasn't satisfying. It was hollow. Max felt it too. He started pacing the cave, whining more than usual. He'd sit by the entrance, staring out at the valley, ears perked like he was waiting for something. At first, I ignored him. "They're gone, Max," I'd mutter. "We won. This is what we wanted. But he didn't stop. His tail didn't wag anymore, his food bowl stayed full. He'd just sit there, looking at Whoville like he was expecting it to wake up. It didn't. I watched the town change day by day. The colors seemed to drain from it. The Whos, so full of life, shuffled around like ghosts. They didn't smile, didn't greet each other. They passed each other in the streets without a word. It was subtle at first. No decorations, no lights, fine. But then the things that weren't Christmas started to disappear. The market, where they used to gather to chatter and trade, was empty. The bakers stopped lighting the ovens. Even the smell of fresh bread, something I'd always hated wafting up the mountain, was gone. The Whos had given up. I didn't understand it. How could they let it all go? Was their stupid holiday the only thing holding them together? And then it hit me. They hadn't just lost Christmas. They'd lost hope. I couldn't stand to watch it anymore. I stayed inside the cave, pretending I didn't care. But the quiet followed me in. It wasn't the quiet of victory. It was the quiet of a graveyard. I tried distracting myself, counting the stolen ornaments, sorting the presents by size, even eating one of their disgusting candy canes. Nothing worked. I found myself pacing, just like Max. I'd catch my reflection in the shiny baubles and scowl at it. The sack, once a symbol of my triumph, now just sat there, heavy and useless. One night, I grabbed a handful of tinsel and threw it into the fire. The flames crackled, eating away the glittering strands, but the sight didn't bring me any joy. If anything, it made the cave darker. The question kept gnawing at me. How do people live without Christmas? And then the harder one. How do I? I first noticed her when Max perked up. His ears twitched, and he let out a low whine. He'd been staring out the cave entrance all day, like always, but this time was different. What now? I grumbled, following his gaze. At first, I didn't see her. Just the snow-covered trail winding up Mount Crumpit. But then, there she was, a tiny figure trudging upward, bundled in a coat far too big for her. She wasn't moving fast, but she wasn't stopping either. Cindy Lou Who. The last person I expected to see. What does she think she's doing? I muttered, more to myself than Max. The dog looked at me, tail thumping once against the floor like he had the answer. I should have ignored her. Let her turn back when the cold got too much, or the trail got too steep. But something kept me at the entrance, watching her climb higher and higher until finally, she reached the ledge. She didn't knock. Didn't hesitate. Just pushed her way in, boots crunching against the icy floor. Max bounded over, tail wagging for the first time in days. Traitor! I muttered. Cindy Lou didn't look scared. She didn't look angry either. She just stood there, cheeks red from the cold, eyes as big and bright as ever. She wasn't carrying anything, no presents, no tinsel, nothing. Just her. Hello, Mr. Grinch, she said, her voice soft but steady. I crossed my arms, leaning back against the wall. You've got a lot of nerve coming here after what I did. She tilted her head, like she was studying me. Why did you do it? Why? I laughed, the sound echoing through the cave. Because I could. Because you Whos think Christmas is everything, and I wanted to see what would happen if I took it away. Her gaze didn't waver. She didn't flinch or argue. She just asked, And what happened? The question hit harder than I expected. I opened my mouth, ready to snap at her, to say something clever and biting. But the words wouldn't come. Because I didn't know the answer. I thought I'd won. I thought I'd taken everything from them. But now, looking at her, at the way she stood there, small but unshaken, I wasn't so sure. I don't owe you an explanation, I muttered, turning away. You don't, she said. But maybe you need one. Her words stayed with me long after she left. I didn't move from the spot where she left me. Not for hours. Her footsteps in the snow had long faded, the cave was silent again, but her voice lingered in my head. Why did you do it? And what happened? Maybe you need one. I kicked at the sack of stolen Christmas, sending a few ornaments rolling across the floor. One stopped at my feet, a shiny red bauble, smooth and perfect. My warped reflection stared back at me, twisted and stretched by the curve of the glass. I picked it up and turned it in my claws, watching the firelight dance across its surface. It was beautiful, I'd give it that. Fragile, too. It wouldn't take much to shatter it. I'd done the same thing to Whoville, hadn't I? Taken something fragile and smashed it into pieces. But looking back now, I wasn't sure what I'd expected to find in the rubble. I turned the bauble over in my hands, over and over, until finally, I threw it into the sack and shoved the whole thing into the corner. Out of sight, out of mind, or so I told myself. The days dragged on. Whoville didn't recover. The streets stayed empty, the shops stayed closed. The smell of fresh bread, the chatter of neighbors, gone. I tried not to watch, but it was impossible not to. Every time I looked down from the mountain, it was there. That hollow, lifeless town. Max didn't help. He started pacing again, whining at the entrance like he was expecting Cindy Lou to come back. She didn't. And yet, it was like she'd left a piece of herself behind, wedged in my mind, impossible to ignore. For the first time, I wondered if I'd gone too far. Stealing their presents, their decorations, their feasts, that was one thing. But the silence? The way the town just stopped? I'd taken something more than Christmas. I'd taken something I couldn't put a name to. Something I couldn't just shove back into the sack and return. I stopped sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Cindy Lou. Her face, her questions. The way she'd looked at me, not with fear, not with anger, but with something else. Pity. The thought made me sick. The Whos weren't supposed to pity me. They were supposed to hate me, curse my name, cry and scream about what I'd done. Instead, they'd done nothing. And Cindy Lou had come all the way up that mountain to look me in the eye and ask why. I didn't have an answer for her then. But I needed one now. One morning, I woke to find Max sitting by the entrance again, his tail wagging faintly. I followed his gaze, expecting to see Cindy Lou's tiny figure trudging up the mountain again. The trail was empty. But the sight of Whoville, quiet and lifeless, hit me harder than it had before. What happens to the world when the lights go out, and they never come back on? I muttered to myself. The question I'd been avoiding since the night I stole Christmas. The answer was right in front of me. The world doesn't fall apart. It fades. I stayed at the cave entrance longer than I ever had, staring down at Whoville. It looked smaller somehow, like the town itself was curling inward, trying to disappear. The houses still stood, the streets were still there, but the life had drained out of it. No laughter, no chatter, no movement. Just stillness. Max sat beside me, his head resting on his paws. He let out a low whine, and for once, I couldn't bring myself to tell him to stop. I clenched my fists, claws digging into my palms. "What do you want me to do, Max?" I snapped. "March back down there and say, 'Oops, my bad'?" They'd never listen. They'd probably slam their doors in my face. Max's tail thumped once against the ground. I let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, sure. Great idea. Just barge into Whoville like nothing happened. That'll fix everything." The truth was, I didn't know what I could do. I didn't know if there was anything I could do. Cindy Lou's words echoed in my head, over and over. "Maybe you need one. An explanation. A reason." I thought I had one before. I thought I hated Christmas because it was loud, and bright, and full of things I couldn't stand. But now, I wasn't so sure. Had it really been Christmas I hated? Or was it something else? Something about the Whos themselves, the way they could come together, laugh, sing, be happy, no matter what. I looked down at Whoville again, and for the first time, I didn't feel triumph or satisfaction. I felt guilt. I didn't know what I was going to do at first. Returning the presents, the decorations, the roast beasts, it seemed so small, so pointless. What good were a few baubles and trinkets if the town had already lost something deeper? But I couldn't sit there anymore. I couldn't keep staring at the sack in the corner of the cave, pretending it wasn't there. Max barked, startling me out of my thoughts. He was standing by the sack, tail wagging, his paws planted firmly on the burlap. All right, I muttered, grabbing the edge of the sack and hoisting it onto my shoulder. Let's see if this makes a difference. The weight of it nearly threw me off balance. It was heavier than I remembered, or maybe I was just weaker than I'd realized. As I trudged down the mountain, the wind howled around me, pushing me back, like the world itself was telling me to stop. But I didn't. By the time I reached the edge of town, the sun was just starting to rise. Whoville looked even worse up close. The snow was gray and crusted over, the windows dark, the streets empty. I tightened my grip on the sack and stepped forward, my footsteps crunching in the frozen snow. At first, no one noticed me. I made it halfway to the square before the first who stepped outside, a shopkeeper, bundled in a scarf too big for him. He froze when he saw me, his eyes wide. Another door creaked open, then another. Soon, the streets were lined with who's, staring at me, their faces a mixture of fear, confusion, and something else I couldn't quite place. I stopped in the middle of the square, dropped the sack at my feet, and raised my hands. The words caught in my throat. I cleared it, trying again. I brought it all back. No one moved. The silence stretched on, thicker than the snow. I don't know if it'll fix anything, I continued, my voice shaking. But it's yours. All of it. Take it. Still, no one moved. And then, out of the crowd, a small figure stepped forward. Cindy Lou Who. She walked right up to me, her boots crunching in the snow, and stopped in front of the sack. She didn't say anything at first, just looked up at me with those same big eyes, her face unreadable. Finally she smiled. Cindy Lou Who smiled, and for a moment, the weight on my chest loosened. It wasn't much, but it was something, a spark in all that gray. She reached out, her tiny hand resting on the edge of the sack. You brought it back, she said softly. I did, I muttered, my voice low. Not that it changes anything. Her eyes squinted a little, like she was thinking, and then she turned to face the crowd. He brought it all back, she called, her voice light but clear. The Who's stirred, murmurs rippling through them like a quiet wind. One by one, they stepped closer, hesitant at first. A few of them hung back, their faces hard, suspicious. Go on, Cindy said, gesturing toward the sack. It's all here. A brave Who, maybe the baker, judging by the flour dusting his coat, stepped forward and reached inside. He pulled out a string of lights, tangled but still glimmering faintly in the morning sun. Another Who followed, pulling out a bundle of stockings. Soon more Who's joined in, their hands digging into the sack, pulling out ornaments, wreaths, even a few roasted hams. The murmurs grew louder, voices rising as they showed each other the things they thought they'd lost forever. I stood there, watching it all, the knot in my stomach tightening. I'd brought back their stuff, sure. But the town still looked the same, empty, hollow. I didn't know if it was enough. Then, something strange happened. The Who's didn't just take their things and leave. They stayed. A group of them began untangling the lights, stringing them up along the edges of the square. Someone found a box of ornaments, and started hanging them on a crooked little tree in the corner. Another Who opened one of the sacks of food and began passing out loaves of bread, apples, even a roast beef someone had cooked days ago but never eaten. The murmurs turned into laughter. The laughter turned into chatter. I took a step back, my shoulders stiff. This wasn't supposed to happen. They weren't supposed to just bounce back. A hand tugged at my arm. I looked down to see Cindy Lou staring up at me. Aren't you going to help? She asked. Help? I snorted, pulling my arm free. I'm the one who did this in the first place. You think they want me messing with their Christmas now? She tilted her head, her brow furrowing. But you brought it back. That means something. I opened my mouth to argue, but I couldn't. Because deep down, I knew she was right. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was the way she looked at me. like I was something more than a thief. Maybe it was the sound of the Who's laughing, something I hadn't heard in weeks. But I reached into the sack, grabbed a strand of lights, and walked over to the nearest Who. "Here," I muttered, shoving it into their hands. The Who blinked at me, then smiled, a real, genuine smile. Before I knew it, I was stringing lights along the square, hanging ornaments on the tree, and even carving a slice of roast beef for Max, who wagged his tail so hard I thought he might knock over the table. The Who's didn't just let me help. They welcomed me. By the time the sun set, the square was glowing. The tree, crooked and scrappy, stood in the center, its branches heavy with ornaments. Strings of lights crisscrossed above us, casting the snow in warm, golden hues. The Who's were singing again. Not the loud, boisterous kind of singing I hated before. This was softer, warmer, like it belonged in the quiet. Cindy Lou stood beside me, humming along. "See?" she said. "See what?" I muttered, though my voice lacked its usual bite. "You didn't just bring Christmas back. You brought them back." I didn't answer. I just stood there, staring at the square, the Who's, the lights. For the first time in my life, I felt still. Not the hollow stillness of before. This was different. The kind of stillness where everything felt right. The singing washed over the square, soft and steady. It wasn't like the blaring carols I'd mocked before. This was different, almost like a heartbeat, slow and deliberate, pulling everything together. I stood there, frozen. My hands hung awkwardly at my sides, the last strand of light still clutched in my claws. I wasn't part of this, not really. Or was I? Max nudged my leg, his tail wagging lazily as he gnawed on the roast beast I'd given him. He seemed at ease for the first time in days, like he belonged here. Cindy Lou tugged on my arm again. "You're smiling," she said, tilting her head. "No, I'm not," I snapped, though I could feel my face twitch, betraying me. "You are." She giggled, the sound light and easy. "It's okay, you know. To be happy." "Happy?" I laughed, a sharp, rough sound that came out more bitter than I'd meant. "What's there to be happy about? I'm still the Grinch. I'm still the one who ruined Christmas." She shook her head, that annoying little smile never fading. "But you fixed it." More Who's were looking at me now. Some smiled. Some nodded. A few even waved. They weren't just tolerating me, they were welcoming me, like I belonged here. It didn't make sense. After everything I'd done, they should have chased me out, slammed their doors, and gone back to pretending I didn't exist. But they didn't. Instead, they sang. They hung lights. They laughed. And every so often, one of them would glance my way, not with anger or fear, but with something else. Forgiveness. It was ridiculous. Impossible. But it was real. I didn't know what to do with it. The warmth in the air, the glow of the lights, the sound of the Who's voices, it was too much. I started to back away, ready to retreat to the safety of my cold, dark cave. But Cindy Lou grabbed my hand, her tiny fingers curling around mine. "Stay," she said simply. I looked down at her, then back at the square. The lights. The tree. The Who's singing in the golden glow. I wanted to say no. I wanted to pull away, to run back to the mountain where it was quiet and safe. But I didn't. Instead, I let her pull me forward, into the light. Something shifted in me then. Not physically. There was no sudden bursting, no dramatic change. But as I stood there, surrounded by the Who's, something inside me softened. The anger, the bitterness, the emptiness, it didn't vanish. But it didn't feel so heavy anymore. For the first time in my life, I felt whole. I wasn't the Grinch who stole Christmas anymore. I was just me.